The road into the mountains narrows like a memory being funneled back into itself. A single lane, shoulder eaten by moss, trees pushing in from both sides as if to keep secrets from spilling out. Under the canopy of fir and cedar, the light is thin, pale, like the kind of daylight that remembers things better than people do. A moss hunter's boot finds something that does not belong, a curve of bone glinting where the earth has been softened, a white tooth showing through green. That discovery will breathe names into the air that have long been without sound. They called her for decades a number of things. Swamp Mountain, Jane Doe, Wolf Creek Jane Doe, the girl whose face no one could remember because their memories had never been given a name. For nearly 50 years, she occupied a quiet shelf in the files of the county, an open case, a photograph of a skull, a corkboard of evidence, a list of possibilities that dwindled as the world moved on. For nearly 50 years, the people who loved her kept asking the same thin question into an empty room. What happened to Marion? Marion Vinetta Nagle McWhorter was 21 the last time she was seen alive. She was the eldest of 5 siblings, a young woman woven into a family of strong voices from the far reaches of the North, Alaska native, kin who shared a language that the plains and cities of Oregon rarely heard. She had the small habitual gestures of someone known to a handful of people, a way of smoothing the edge of her sleeve, of running a hand through the short braid she favored, a laugh that started low and then filled the room. She was last seen at a mall in Tigard in October 1974, a point on a map that would come to stand for absence. After she disappeared, the years arranged themselves into a long column. Birthdays unmarked, a missing plate at family dinners, the quiet accumulation of grief. When the skeletal remains were found in 1976, they told a different kind of story. Not one of the quick snapshots of presence, a grocery run, a laughter in the kitchen, but of fragments. A pair of Levi's jeans that had once fit a youthful body, a clog-style shoe, half buried, frayed edges of a leather coat, beads on a belt, 2 small metal rings. The scatter of objects read like a private language, one only partially deciphered by those holding it. They became evidence, yes, but also a catalog of intimacy, things someone had worn, someone had carried, someone had been. For decades, the county archives cataloged these objects and the bones they accompanied. For decades, investigators did the work of the living. They interviewed, cross-checked, chased leads that are sometimes bright and often empty. They photographed the skull, made sketches of what the woman could have looked like, shared the approximation with other detectives and with the public. They pinned her case to bulletin boards of hope. They waited for a hand to close over the thread that would lead back to a family. The thread arrived not in a single blaze. It arrived slowly, through the patient accretion of science. Forensic technology changed, the same way a long, slow tide changes the shape of a coast. Where once investigators had only bone and clothing and a few scattered notes, they now had access to DNA techniques that could read the faintest book of identity encoded in bone. They had the capacity to stitch the strands of genetic ancestry together, to find cousins in databases, and to build family trees of strangers until the picture resolved into a face. It was forensic genetic genealogy that finally spoke the name. A distant relative, a first cousin once removed, uploaded DNA to an open genealogy site. Someone else, quietly and with no fanfare, had years earlier done what families do when they are trying to find what was lost. Marion's sister, Valerie, submitted her DNA in 2023. From those 2 small acts, set like pins in different places on a map, experts began to sketch the curves of connection. Lines that had lain dormant for decades tightened, and a name appeared where there had been only the impression of a life. When officials made the announcement in 2025, they said it plainly. A case that had been cold for 49 years had a name again. Marion Vinetta Nagle McWhorter. For the family, the sound of the name was a kind of surfacing, a breach of air, a new and painful breath. Valerie Nagle remembers the phone call as an implosion of memory and relief. She had been 11 the last time her sister's face had been present in the house. The years had folded over the family in a sort of waiting, that ache that comes from not knowing how to close a wound. "I was very surprised that they called," Valerie said later, a sentence laced with the oddness of joy and sorrow in the same breath. "I was really glad that they found me through DNA. The objects found with the remains were small, stubborn witnesses. A leather belt with beadwork. That beadwork speaking to a particular cultural style, a small argument for who she may have been and where she came from. A frayed, tasseled leather jacket with the weight of hands that had worn it. A clog shoe that fit a foot, now gone. The bones had been gnawed at by time and weather. The evidence was abbreviated and elliptical. Yet together, the bones and the personal items told of someone who had passed through the world with the same ordinary things anyone would carry: clothing, jewelry, the habit of how one unlaces a shoe. The details gave the dead their human scale again. Investigators returned to the diagrams and the old notes in light of the new identification. They reopened interviews, reread the notebooks of the 1970s and the typed-up statements that had once been filed away. They looked with the fresh clarity that only time and distance can grant. What seemed then like fragments might now be patterns. In family recollections, there are often details that sit quietly for years, like seeds waiting for rain. One of those details was a small, ordinary memory Marion had shared before she disappeared. She had tried to arrange a ride with an aunt and had mentioned a man in a white pickup truck. Such a line is easy to dismiss in the small world of a family, but as an investigative lead, it takes on new weight. The sheriff's office said the circumstances of Marion's death remain under investigation. Identification is a door. It does not always open to answers, but it does open to better questions. There is a particular cruelty in time when it chooses to drag its feet in the presence of a family's need. For Marion's siblings, the years had layered themselves into lives that would not stop being lived while grief stayed. Siblings moved to different cities. Marriages came and went. Children were born. Each birthday without Marion became a hinge, a formal moment for reminding oneself that something essential had been lost. Identification did not bring her back. It brought instead the possibility of a burial with a name, of a story being stitched into the family album where blank pages had remained for 49 years. There is also a cultural frame around this story that cannot be ignored. Marion's identification sits within a larger, wounding national context. Indigenous women and girls have been disproportionately represented among the missing. Generations of families have learned to live in a double absence: the absence of the person and the frequent absence of full investigative urgency that often accompanies cases of Native women. The discovery of Marion's identity is both intensely private and inevitably public. It is a family reclaiming a member and a broader community marking a victory for persistence, for forensic science, and for the insistence that every story matters. In the years since the discovery of the bones, the county's investigative tools had changed in ways that would have seemed like sorcery to officers in the 1970s. Once, an investigator's best option was to move the pieces around by hand, to send photographs to other departments, to place notices in local newspapers, to hope that someone would remember. Now there are databases that can cast a net across lines of kinship and geography, algorithms that can weigh genetic distance and suggest where a family tree might fork. But forensic science is not a replacement for human work. It augments it. Genealogists build the family stories to fit the skeletons. Detectives then return to the scene, to the interviews, to the people who have watched a life thin into rumor. Those who were charged with the case say the identification was a collaborative achievement. Detectives, medical examiner staff, forensic genealogists, and the family itself. Each played a role, some technical and some intimate. The bones were tested and retested. The fragments of DNA were read and compared. The living relatives agreed to be the anchors in a family tree that had otherwise been an outline. And the distant cousin, who uploaded DNA in what might have been a routine step into ancestry research, likely did not imagine that their sample would ripple into closure for a sister living across decades and distance. There is a particular image that returns in telling this story. Photos of a young woman in a brownish sepia yearbook pose, teeth showing in an uncertain smile, hair parted and tamed. Family pictures that had remained in drawers for decades were brought out and unfolded like maps. In one photograph, Marion stands at the center of family life, a younger sister peeking out from the side. To her family, these images are not evidence but memory, and memory is the ground upon which grief and love both stand. The sheriff's office was careful in public statements to emphasize that identity is one of several steps toward resolution. Names matter because they allow the living to speak directly to a life and because they allow investigators to ask more precise questions. They can locate who might have known Marion intimately, who she might have been traveling with, who she may have met in the weeks before she vanished. But identification does not always hand over the perpetrator. The world has many kinds of closure, and not all of them are clean. Forensic genetic genealogy has, in the last decade, changed the landscape of cold cases. In this case, it provided an intersection between private family histories and public evidence. It formed a bridge between what someone posted to an ancestry website, a digital seed, and the bones that had sat under moss for decades. The technique has been praised for bringing people names, for returning the dead to the living, and for delivering a kind of arithmetic justice. The cold case becomes warm, then hot, as leads are once more followed. But it has also inspired debate about privacy, about consent, about the ways in which DNA that was intended for family discovery becomes an instrument of criminal investigation. For families like Marion's, these debates are theoretical in the face of an urgent, quiet hunger, the hunger to know what happened to a sister, a daughter, a woman who stopped walking one day and never returned. In their first interview after the identification, Marion's sister spoke without flourish, with the restrained mixture of relief and the old, always present mourning that binds survivors. The official statement was small but freighted. Discovery of a name means there is now a path to answers. For the community in Linn County, there was a recognition that these landscapes, the mossy ground, the cold creeks, the dense stands of trees, have long memories. They remember footsteps and the silence left behind. They remember the shape of human commerce, the roads, the trucks, the patterns of travel. They remember the small detail of the white pickup truck noted in an old family memory. It is in details like that where the work begins again, more pointed and more specific than it was when the discovery of the bones was first made. What the family wants, first and always, is to bury their dead with a name. There are rituals that follow identification, small acts that are all in service of giving someone back the dignity of a story. A church service, a gravestone that bears the carved letters of Marion Vinetta Nagle McWhorter, the reading of names and the returning of photographs to frames and walls. These are practical acts of healing. They do not restore the lost hours or the missed years, but they do provide a place where a family can pour their grief and be seen. There is also the broader work of the county and of investigative partners who remain engaged. The old notes that sat in boxes must be re-examined for discrepancies, for names that had seemed trivial. Witnesses who were once questioned may now be interviewed again with a different lens. A vehicle description, like a white pickup, can be cross-checked now with registration data from the era and with recall interviews. Even if decades have reshaped the landscape and moved people on, evidence can still yield new truths, or at least new directions to pursue. Ultimately, the story of Marion's identification is one of patience, of persistent human attention yoked to advancing technology. It is about the way the living refuse to let the dead be anonymous. It is the work of family members who never stopped searching, of investigators who did not forget, and of scientists who learned to read the faintest traces of what makes us who we are. It is also a sobering reminder that there are still too many names in the margins of county ledgers, in aged files, in photographs fading under lamplight. Each identification is a victory, yes, but it is also an evidence-laden arrow pointing at how much work remains. There is a small, almost defiant tenderness in how these stories end now, not with the picture of a skull, but with the turning of a page in a family album. Pictures are framed, names spoken out loud, and a sister who was a child when the world lost Marion can, at last, say her name in full. The investigation continues, because justice is a separate thing from identification and often slower. But the most elemental need, to have a person called by their name, has been met. For Marion's family, that naming brings with it a complex, serrated relief. For the community, it is a reminder that the work of memory and of law must go hand in hand. If we take away anything from this slow arc of a case, it is this: time does not always heal, but it does sometimes uncover. The earth keeps its own ledger, and so do the people who refuse to let grief grow rootless. When a name returns to a family after 49 years, it returns like a tide, slow, powerful, inexorable. Marion Vinetta Nagle McWhorter will now be recorded in the history of Linn County, not as an unnamed body found near Wolf Creek, but as a woman who lived and laughed and left a family behind. The rest of the story remains to be written: who she was with, why she left, and how the circumstances of her death will be understood. Those questions belong now to detectives and to time, and to the family that has waited so long to hear the answer. In the quiet that follows an identification, the living tend to their small tasks: photograph frames adjusted, envelopes addressed, an order of service printed. They are ordinary actions in the shadow of extraordinary pain. They do what keeps the world steady. They tuck a small book of photographs into a satchel. They walk to the edge of the property and look out toward the road that leads to the town. They remember a laugh, a hairstyle, the way a dress folded. They give a name back to the world, and in doing so, they reclaim the right to tell the rest of the story. The mountains keep their silence, as mountains do, but the names echoed around their edges now are more complete. A woman who had been called by geology and geography for nearly 50 years, Swamp Mountain, Wolf Creek, now has a name that stretches across generations and states and the wide spaces of kinship. That name offers both an end to anonymity and a beginning to the search for answers. In the months and years to come, detectives will follow the thin bones of evidence and the thick braided threads of family memory until the picture is fuller. For now, the identification stands as proof that even the quietest of discoveries can, with time and care, become a story with a name.